Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of the Influence Continuum. I have with me one of the world authorities and experts in the world, in my opinion, someone that I've known for decades as a colleague, Joe Szimhart, with us, who has incredible knowledge, and he's a just voracious reader. He challenges my reading history, Joe, and writes reviews about what he writes too, which I kudos to you, Joe. But I just want to introduce you to my audience. We have so many things to cover relevant to today and the internet and information warfare and the explosion of just crazy conspiracy theories and cult groups and shamans and all kinds of things. So let's start by just saying that you are a cult intervention specialist. You've been a media consultant since the early 80s, helping families and individuals internationally through consultation and intervention. We've done a bunch of cases. You collaborate with Freedom of Mind on cases, which I'm grateful for. You've worked for 25 years as a caseworker at a psychiatric emergency hospital in Pennsylvania till 2023, which you retired from, but you have a depth of knowledge about psychological dysfunction and evaluating folks. It's very unique. But you really are an incredible artist. You have a BA from the University of Dayton, certificate in painting from the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. You did a course in social psychology. You're an expert in social psychology in my mind. And you've written a Cult Diary was published, Santa Fe, Bill Tate, and Me, How an Artist Became a Cult Interventionist, which was released in 2020. And you created a YouTube channel called Cults and the Occulture. But you have a story. Like me, you're a survivor, right? So why don't we start by introducing, let's assume people don't know you, even though you've been around and doing so many interviews. How did you get interested in this, and how did you come to be such an expert?
Yeah, it's a sideways journey from what I was expecting to do. But as you know, and we both ended up in what we regard as fascist right-wing cults.
Yep.
Totally different approaches.
Yep.
But basically the same support of that ultranationalism that resulted before and after World War II.
Yep.
And so we were both in that kind of a mixture of groups. So having said that, so I've been around a few years. I'll be 77 this year. And
you look marvelous, Joe, by the way.
Well, I stay healthy by luck and by some effort.
Yeah.
My mom just turned 100, so that gives you some idea.
Congratulations on that. Good genes.
Yeah, what's interesting in my background, I grew up Catholic, and I went to Catholic school, and I was an altar boy, and I could recite the Mass in Latin, back in the day before Vatican II. So I was inculcated or indoctrinated or dogmatized, whatever you want to call that, into the Catholic milieu. And during college, of course, I went to a Catholic college, the University of Dayton, that was founded by Maronist brothers.
Okay.
And like a lot of young Catholics, I lapsed from the faith because I began to look at things more critically, and Noah's Ark didn't make sense anymore. And, what is the virgin birth all about? And who are these saints that we're supposed to worship? And, so naturally, the inquisitive young mind can tear that down quite easily because it's an artifice, it's a belief system, and it's not necessarily science, right?
Right.
So it was in the late 60s. A lot of consciousness experimentation was going on. I was involved in some of that. I did a little bit of anti-war protesting, but I wasn't too much into it. I did some drugs, psychedelics. I got God conscious, on trips, and figured out that death is something that doesn't exist. All that big stuff that you learn when you
Yeah, and
or take
psychedelics is
psilocybin.
making a revival, so we'll
Yeah,
circle
it just
around to that. But
yeah, it
please
amazes me
continue.
that right now, actually, there's some legitimate research being done, which was held back
Yes,
because it was delegitimized and illegalized back in the '60s. But
right.
having said that, I also saw a lot of damage among the hippie generation and my peers. Some of them ended up in hospitals after a LSD trip, and other ones never recovered from feeling depersonalized after so much activity like that. They
Yep,
kind of became what's called anime. They weren't quite in touch with reality for years. So
right.
there was harm done during that leftist consciousness explosion experimentation. And there
Yep,
was an awful lot of cults that emerged out of that. The Jesus movement, the gurus that came over from India and Japan and other places. You know, Lyndon Johnson in 1966 lifted the Asian Exclusion Act. That's not what it was called, but that was a nickname for it. And it gave access to the United States and the West to a lot of these characters that we call prophets and gurus and wise men. And they set up camp here.
yep.
Million,
Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and
yep,
TM is around a lot, even though he was
right.
such a fraud. And Yogi
Yeah,
Bhajan.
Sri Chinmoy set up in 1966. Yogi
Yep.
Bhajan came
He
later.
was in
Muktananda,
Queens. He was right near
yes,
where I grew up.
yeah. You know, and all of these guys triggered spin-off groups as well. And then there was the self-help explosion that was, encounter groups in Esalen and Big Sur led to these experiments like EST and LifeSpring and all of that were using what we would call hypnotic techniques in order to
Uh,
influence
I would
people to
definitely call
make
them
changes.
hypnotic
Yep.
techniques and brainwashing techniques. Yep.
Yeah. So you and I,
Synanon, let's not forget them, the drug rehab,
yeah,
movement.
and we still have drug rehab scams going on. Some of them are supposedly Christian based, but they're more like boot camps,
Yep.
which use an old military brainwashing model in order to bend
Yep.
people's minds to their will.
Yep.
The recovery rate from those particular organizations is very good. No better than any other rehab. So
Yep.
anyway, with all that said, I got into a reaction to all that after I left art school in 1975, and I was kind of like, I stopped using drugs. I said, this isn't going anywhere. And my art career was decent, and in art school, I didn't win any awards, which dismayed me because that was the main way you would know if you were any good, by these prizes that the Pennsylvania Academy gave out every year. But during my final show, the wall we set up, my wall practically sold out to collectors, which was unusual. And I thought, well, maybe I got something here.
You're
So
very talented, I can
so
tell
I,
you. I grew up with people educated about art, and you've really got
yeah.
a
So
talent, buddy.
I'm not a financial success, but I've had some good feedback over the years, and I produced thousands of pieces of work.
Yeah.
So I took my talents and I moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico. My first wife and I were separated for a number of reasons, and in my memoir, Santa Fe, Bill Tate and me, I met this character, Bill Tate, the first day I was in Santa Fe. And we got talking. He owned a little gallery, like a mom and pop gallery. He was a wounded World War II vet who was crippled somewhat. And he had a white beard and white hair, prematurely white. He looked a lot older than he was, but very interesting man. And we got to be great friends. He died in 1987. He was 68 years old, but I knew him for 12 years. So in his gallery, we're talking and I'm browsing around and I pick up this magazine. It just came out 6 months before I got there. And this painting
American
is
artist, it says. Yep.
right. And the feature article is about this painter, Nicholas Rourke, that painted this. This is partial of one of his paintings.
Yep.
And I read the article on Nicholas Rourke, and I find out he's a mystic. He had quite a following back in the 20s and 30s. He began a society called the Agni Yoga Society, which
Mm-hmm.
is the Hindu god Agni, the god of fire, the god of wisdom, the god of psychic energy.
Mm.
It's an ancient god in India. And him and his wife were followers of Madame Blavatsky's theosophy, and they revisioned that. His wife, Helena, was a channeler of Blavatsky's masters, Moria, and Kutumi, but she was sort of the channeler, although he also channeled. So anyway, they were attracted some very high level people, including at one point in their career in the early 30s, late 20s, Henry Wallace, who was Secretary of Agriculture under FDR, was one of their top disciples. So they had influence in U.S. government at the time, and also in some way in Russian government. So he was playing both ends against the middle in a way. I can talk about that later. But Rorge is not well known. In fact, the Agni Yoga group was never mentioned in sociological studies of cults when I was getting into this field as a young scholar or amateur scholar in the late 70s and early 80s. You never saw Agni Yoga come up. Yet it had a deep impact on our culture as well as Russian and Eastern European culture. And in Russia today, it estimated about 3 million followers of Agni Yoga. It's one of the biggest theosophical sects, including the Gorbachevs. Raisa Gorbachev was a member. Putin's ex-wife was a member of Agni Yoga. So it has this interesting esoteric occulture influence on people's thinking.
Yes.
There's other people like this, but if you don't understand how that kind of cult works, you're not going to understand how the minds of those believers work.
I want to underscore that. This is really important. So many influencers today are operating on these belief systems from really crazy, authoritarian, weirdo cults, but it's not named. And we'll get into QAnon and I Am and Church Universal and Michael Flynn and all kinds of things that are really relevant to today. I did not know about Putin's ex-wife, though. You taught me something new.
There was a huge Rorich center that was set up in Moscow with statues of Rorich and like a museum, but it was more like almost like a recruitment center, when you went inside of it, according to reports. Now, since Putin, just to finish this part up, since Putin became more aligned with the Russian Orthodox Church as being the state religion, the Russian Orthodox Church names cults, and they don't like Jehovah's Witnesses, they don't like Moonies, they don't like Scientology, and they don't like Agni Yoga, and they regarded Agni Yoga as, quote, satanic, unquote. So Putin they moved the Agni Yoga Society from the middle of Moscow to this little nondescript building somewhere, further away from the center of the city. So it's become, persona non grata now in Putin's world to be an Agni Yogi when in fact he was married to one at one point.
Interesting.
So it's power
they
politics.
were not banned though, as far as you know.
Not completely. It's as Robert Lifton said, no totalist system is total. There's always rebels. There's always arguments inside. It's never perfect. They're always tweaking it, and there's always leaks. So the same thing happens in Russia. There's protesters there that get away with a certain amount, and there are people that follow other religions in Russia. The Russian church isn't totalistic in the sense of North Korea, for instance.
Yeah. But I want to get back to the U.S. and politics and Trump and Flynn.
So following my story here, so after I read this, also in Bill Tate's gallery, this is the book that he had, and I got it after he died from his daughter.
Read the title.
I'm going to read it to you. It's called Masonic, Hermetic, Kabbalistic, and Rosicrucian Spiritual Philosophy by Manly P. Hall. That's a mouthful.
Yes.
Now, he was an erudite writer of the esoteric. He was a kind of a fringe Freemason, a maverick. He was a follower of Madame Blavatsky. He had a Blavatsky shrine in his Philosophical Research Society in California, where he had his center. Interesting enough, years after I left the cult, Church Universal, that was part of Blavatsky's system, I interviewed Manly P. Hall's secretary. She was still alive, and he had died, and I got to know quite a bit about him through her. But anyway, that's going way ahead in 1982. So this is 1975.
Right.
And I'm reading this stuff, and it says the secret teachings of all ages, being an interpretation of the secret teachings concealed in the rituals, allegories, and mysteries of all ages, Manly P. Hall. And here is Bill Tate's signature and stamp on here because it was part of his gallery.
Wow.
So it's a piece of my history. So I read this, and it's very dense writing. It's hard to understand if you've never encountered anything like this before. Now, I've had 40 years to digest all this stuff, and when I look back, it's kind of silly to me right now, and I could see that Manly P. Hall was way off the reality rails in how he interpreted things. For instance, there's a passage in here that he believes, and shows proof, that Francis Bacon wrote the Shakespeare plays. Now that myth has been put up by esotericists for a couple hundred years.
Yeah.
And as if Shakespeare was too stupid to write those excellent plays. And of course, the evidence is that he wasn't that stupid. He was raised kind of like a Catholic family that was educated, and he just had a brilliant mind. He was like a Mozart, a prodigy.
You're talking about Shakespeare, not
Shakespeare, not Hall. Hall, was influenced quite a bit by the teachings of Pythagoras. And, Pythagoras influences a lot of Freemasonry with his ideas of sound and geometry and sacred geometry and all that sort of thing. That comes from ancient Egypt because he studied in Egypt, and he also maybe studied in India to some extent. So Pythagorean systems are basically pyramidal. They come from the top down. There's this kind of like in our dollar bill, the eye of God is on top, the all-seeing eye, the great seal of the United States. And so Pythagoras was kind of like a channel of God at the top that brought this great wisdom down to the aristocracy, the inner core of his followers, his cult, so to speak, the Pythagoreans. And then they would govern ended up in kind of a governorship of different city-states in Italy back in that day. Well, it turned out he wasn't a good manager. He was very authoritarian, and the people began to get upset with his nepotism, meaning only the elite that were Pythagoreans were getting the good jobs. Naturally, there was rebellion, and Pythagoras himself, the legends go, was chased out, and he may have, most of the better scholarships say, may have killed himself by starving himself to death. Now, this idea of starving yourself to death in ancient kinds of cults, Gnostic cults and whatever, even the Christian variety, they practiced something called the Endora. The Endora meant that when you come to this place in your adult life where you realize that everything's an illusion, the God that created this world is an evil God, and there's no reason for you being here, and you're ready to merge back into the light, you can take this path of just not eating and drinking, and people will help you and comfort you and pass back into the light because you're conscious. So, you could see Pythagoras choosing something like that. He was that kind of a guy. He was also very brilliant.
This is the first time I'm hearing you talk about Pythagoras. I mean, I go back to elementary school and learning geometry. That's right.
He was the Pythagorean theorem. Some of his ideas of music and were brilliant. Even to this day, just because he was a cult leader in quotes doesn't mean he wasn't smart.
Right. But I'm just saying, thank you for educating me yet again on another piece of history that people should actually know about.
Yeah, this idea of Pythagoras as a great magus or a great channel of God wisdom, calling himself the first philosopher, the lover of knowledge, the lover of wisdom, the lover of science. That was expounded in Manly P. Hall's book, and I saw Pythagoras through that vision. All right, so that led me to other things. I went to the Agni Yoga Society in New York City, and I got to know the lady that was one of the earliest disciples of Nicholas and Helena Roerich. Her name was Sina Fosdick, and she and I exchanged letters. I bought all the Agni Yoga mystical books. I read them for a couple years. I was into it, so to speak.
Yep.
My wife at the time was not, and I was off in metaphysical world. Then I came across in Santa Fe that same day the teachings of Guy and Edna Ballard. There was an I Am Temple in Santa Fe. This is one of their early books from 1940, and a voice of the I Am.
The Ballards, very important. Ballards. Yep, I Am is huge with QAnon, I believe.
Yeah, so the idea behind the Ballards was this, that they took up this thing in the early 30s saying that Guy Ballard had gone into some secret mountain after meeting this character, Saint Germain, this mystic that had died and was in a spiritual state, was an ascended master. He went into the mountain of Mount Shasta and other places. And Guy Ballard was initiated into the great wisdom of the ascended masters, and then what's called the Great White Brotherhood. And then he wrote these books with his wife called Unveiled Mysteries and The Magic Presence that were kind of like Carlos Castaneda tales with, Don Juan the Mystic, which were fiction, but they were written as spiritual autobiographies, as if they were real. Right?
And people believed them as real. I did when I read Castaneda.
I did too originally.
Darn.
And so up to a million people followed the Ballards back in the 30s. Mm-hmm. They had about 50,000 members around the Chicago area. Mm-hmm. There's a huge building they still own. It's about 10 stories, I think, in downtown Chicago, and the I Am Temple is in there. I visited that place one time.
Yep.
So they were quite successful. So I went to the I Am leaders, and I wanted to become part of the group, thinking maybe I'll get into this thing. And one of the things they did was called decreeing, which is a form of rapid chanting where they would chant these decrees, invoking color rays of energy, the blue ray, the rose ray, the pink ray, the yellow ray. They would not invoke black, for instance. That was considered evil. What I'm worrying, you would never find an I Ammer wearing black or brown or gray or checkered colors, because those are negative energies that bring your energy down.
So they say.
Right.
Yeah.
So they were into this whole magical thinking of sympathetic magic and with colors and vibrations and channeling. So the idea of decreeing, which was central to this group, was that you could change everything, your health, your wealth, world peace, through this rapid out loud chanting in groups, these decrees. Mm-hmm. One of the first ones I learned with a spin-off group of the I Am, the Church Universal and Triumphant, which we'll get to, Elizabeth Prophet's group, was I am a being of violet fire, I am the purity God desires. And now when you say that rapidly, I'm a being of fire, you can't understand it. Right. And that's how they chant it. While you're doing that, you're supposed to visualize this violet fire going from below your feet up through your R's and your chakras and cleansing you of everything. It was the cleansing flame released by Saint Germain for the coming of the new age, the purple age, the age of the violet flame. From the 30s, this was supposed to have been happening, and it was supposed to prevent war and everything. And so they believed in the science of the spoken word thing, the decreeing.
Science with air quotes.
Yeah, exactly. It's a form of New Thought. Now, New Thought came out in the 19th century, and it was started by a guy named Phineas Quimby. And the idea behind New Thought is that you could do positive affirmations. Norman Vincent Peale was, for instance, a product of this.
Right.
You could do positive thinking.
Family grew up in Norman Vincent
right.
Peale's
and you
stuff.
see New Thought infecting Christianity through the name it and claim it movements. There's millions of people believe in this. If you say prayer strongly enough and powerfully enough and forcefully enough, God will have to listen to you.
Oh, so that's where the prosperity stuff comes in.
Exactly. And that's the kind of prayer that Flynn does.
Michael Flynn, former DIA director.
Yes. Yeah. So these characters believe that you can move God, kind of like commanding your dog to go fetch the newspaper and bring it back. You can do these prayers, and God and his archangels will go out and cleanse the world and stop war. And, and in the groups I was in, they believed that you could actually stop a bullet by chanting that was coming at your head. They literally believe that kind of thing. And just to come up to speed, of course, I practiced this, and I found this isn't really working very well. Everybody seems to be sick and dying in the group.
Yeah.
And, when it really comes down to it, you can challenge these people, the most powerful decreers there are out there, the people that believe in it the most, and say, warm up this cup of coffee for me with your decrees, and guess what's going to happen?
Nothing. Yes.
So it's imaginary energy is what it is.
Yeah.
So that's what the decrees
I have to
are.
just switch continents, but it made me think of Soka Gakkai, the Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, and you can manifest a Porsche or get a promotion or a girlfriend just by chanting Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. And Tina Turner was into it, and many other celebrities. But anyway, back to New Thought.
You can do this decreeing and Nam Myoho Renge Kyo or whatever, and get your best job or find the best apartment, or we put this energy out to the universe, and the universe will listen and help you out, whatever.
Yeah, and that connects with the law of positive attraction. If you just believe it 100%, the universe will magically manifest these things.
And this is the out. If the universe didn't help you, either that wasn't the will of God, or you didn't believe enough. So you're always, the victim's always to blame in these systems.
Yeah, you were not pure enough. You had sin. Right. You didn't give enough money to the leader of the cult.
There you go. Anyhow, so I got involved in all this kind of thing from a very experiential point of view. Now, I never joined the inner core of the I Am. They wouldn't let me, and I'll tell you why. Mm-hmm. When I went to meet their leaders, the main leaders had died. The Ballards were gone. Mrs. Ballard died in the early 70s before I came to Santa Fe. And the leaders in Santa Fe, Mr. and Mrs. Swanson, were part of a committee. So they weren't channelers. They weren't messengers. They were a committee. The last messengers ever to appear on Earth were supposed to be the Ballards. Everyone else is fake, right? Of the Ascended Masters. So when I went to the Swansons and I asked them, they started interviewing me. And of course, I'm this kind of like quasi hippie guy. And I was honest with them. They asked me if I ever took LSD. And I said, yeah, among other things. And they told me that, well, in this lifetime, I cannot become part of the I Am because I can't handle the energy. That drug put a hole in my aura, and I wouldn't be able to hold the force, and it would harm me if I started doing these degrees. So I couldn't join. I think what happened is, looking back, is they had some hippies come in back in the 60s and try this out, and some of them really freaked out during the decreeing sessions because it's pretty intense, and they were very imbalanced, and right. Nobody wants a cult member that's acting nuts. Right. That isn't a good deployable agent. You want to get them out of there. So in their magical thinking, they blamed it on LSD putting a hole in your aura or whatever the hell they were thinking. But so I thought, well, I don't know. Maybe they know. Maybe they know more than I do. So I kind of gave it up for a while. Well, the last thing I'm going to say about this is I met these people the first day I was in Santa Fe, Faith and Warren, and they had just come back from a Church Universal and Triumphant conference, one of the early ones, and they were just pumped with being students of the Ascended Masters and all of this. But they wouldn't tell me. They kind of kept it secret like a lot of people do, because they know that if they just spill it out, people are going to think they're nuts. So they don't talk about it. But a year later, they found out I'd been reading these Agni Yoga books. And then they just blossomed. They were so happy because they told me that there's one of the Agni Yoga books, Agni Yoga, right? That their cult, Church Universal and Triumphant, set up this thing called Summit University, and it had 4 levels, right? And each level had 12 weeks of instruction. The final level was all Agni Yoga teachings. So I had already done the final level, and I was already in without knowing it, in that sense. So I kind of thought, well, I'll check this out. And I went to 3 of their conferences. I went to the first one in 1979 for 4 days. I was out there with several thousand people in California, listening to channeling and decreeing with them.
Was Mark Prophet alive at that time?
No, he died in 1973. He had a cardiac arrest.
So it was Elizabeth Clare Prophet that was running the cult.
Was the leader, yeah. By the way, Prophet was their legal name. Mark Prophet was born with the Prophet name. That wasn't...
Yeah, Prophet. How convenient.
Yeah. So the other thing that hooked me in was that the Prophets claimed that their youngest daughter at the time, Tatiana, was the reincarnation of Helen O'Rourke, who was the founder of Agni Yoga, and then Helena died in 1955, and then this little girl was born, and I wanted to see what I felt if I met this little girl, and I did see her at the conference, and I thought, well, that's kind of cool. Here she is again, what's going to happen when she grows up? And so I was into it. When I got back from that conference, I cut my hair shorter, I stopped wearing silver jewelry, I changed my diet to vegetarian. I stopped wearing the bad colors. I stopped listening to rock and roll music. My wife at the time thought, "What the hell happened to you?" You know,
You had
and
an experience.
I had a real experience. Yeah, and so within 6 months, we were divorced.
Mm.
Because I was getting into it more and more. So I went to another conference right after we filed for divorce in the fall, and after that, I started thinking more critically about the whole thing. I said, this is just way over my head. And the reason that happened is I tried to recruit two friends of mine, two ladies I knew, and I taught them everything. And as I was listening to myself talk, I kept thinking, this is bullshit. This is bullshit. That thing in the back of my mind, that little
The
skeptic.
real you, the critic.
Yeah, exactly. But I didn't understand why it was bullshit. I didn't quite get it. So I backed off from the teachings. I went to one more conference as a participant observer this time. I didn't do any decreeing. I watched the crowd. I talked to people. I interviewed someone that left the 3HO Happy, Healthy, Holy cult.
That's the Yogi Bhajan cult.
Yogi Bhajan's group, and joined Elizabeth Prophet's group. And he told me his story, interesting story, which I'm not going to get into, but he became head over heels into this. And Bhajan told him that he was going to die and everything if he joined Elizabeth Clare Prophet. And Elizabeth Clare Prophet said that she'll guard him of all of Bhajan's dark energy. And he felt all this stuff happening to him, like he was purified of Bhajan's evil influence under.
Bhajan was evil, but so was Elizabeth Clare.
She was evil in a different way. She was kind of nutty evil, I think, but very manipulative.
Yeah.
So I interviewed him and a few other people, and one thing I did, which was interesting, I climbed this hill above the grounds in Malibu, way up there, and I looked at this place from a distance, and I thought, this is pretty small and insignificant compared to what's going on around the landscape here, So I got psychological and physical distance, and it was soon after that a number of other things happened, and I had some panic attacks for a month because I didn't know if I was making the right decision. I didn't have anyone to talk to, my ex-wife.
So you were looking at Mount Shasta, or you were just
no. This was in Malibu foothills.
Okay.
Where this place, they called it Camelot, but it was like an old Catholic seminary that they had repurposed. They bought it. Now, what's interesting is when Church Universal sold that property in the Malibu foothills, they sold it to Nam Shinrikyo, to that cult.
Oh. The Japanese sarin gas cult?
No. I'm sorry. Nam-myoho Renge Kyo cult.
Oh, the Soka Gakkai.
Soka Gakkai. I'm sorry, I'm confusing
no worries.
myself here. Soka Gakkai. So they sold it to that cult, and they moved to Montana in the mid-'80s at that point to set up their big bomb.
The Church Universal and Triumphant, and that's where she later had her prophecy about Russia nuking us and made all these bomb shelters.
They made a big one that could hold 2,000 people, as big as a football field up there.
Yeah.
Plus a lot of smaller ones. So,
and that's when I was on Oprah Winfrey with the ex-members, the daughter and stuff. And if I can interrupt for 1 second and just say I was on with Ken Paolini and, oh God, I'm blocking on the name. There were two daughters. One was still in, one was out. And the one that was, out
was Moria, and the one was in was Aaron.
Thank you. Aaron. Yeah, so Aaron, and then they had a PR guy, and then they had a so-called cult expert who doesn't believe in brainwashing. One of these new.
Yeah, they had Murray Simon on. He was the astrologer for.
Anyway, the reason I'm interrupting the flow is just to say I'm looking at the audience, and there are all these cult members in the audience, and they were staring at me, and they were mumbling.
Oh.
And later, I found out they were decreeing smash, blast, destroy, annihilate, consume Steve Hassan. Is what they told me.
Well, I got the same thing after I came out against the group, and they were decreeing against me. People that left the group later told me this was going on because they tended to do that in secret in the intergroup.
Yeah.
And the I-Amers used to do these smash, blast, annihilate, consume against any liberal, especially FDR and other people. They were totally fascist and against any
so it's a form of voodoo, right? It's like putting a curse, they think.
Well,
that they have
let me
power.
back up a bit. This is
Sure.
very common human behavior. It's if you look back at the idea of mantra in ancient India, and it
Yeah.
still goes on. Mantra is a way of invoking a god or ascended master and saying a ritualistic prayer in order to get something.
Hmm.
To get blessings, to bless your family, to prevent war, whatever. So the idea of decreeing and of affirmations and all that goes way back.
Mm-hmm.
One translation of mantra is to cast a spell. It's not the
Interesting.
more philosophical translation, but it literally can mean that. So essentially, you're practicing a kind of crude witchcraft when you're doing that
Interesting.
kind of prayer and that kind of decreeing or whatever. You believe that you're sending out real energy, and real energy is going to do something out there, like
Yeah, and
warm up
let's
my cup
say
of coffee.
categorically, you and I are still around decades later, and Prophet's dead, and all that decreeing against us didn't work.
Well, it's not only
Oops.
prophet. I can think of of any number of gurus I've criticized publicly, and they were supposed to have this kind of magic power.
Right.
I mean, I don't take pills. I haven't had any major illnesses. I sleep
Right.
okay.
Yeah.
So I don't know where the power is. Now I kid around with people when I say I must have a hell of a guardian angel because it's not working. So
Right. Well, let's keep going because this is
yeah.
fascinating, but I really want to get to because I meet so many people who are into I am and guardian angels and all kinds of just off the chart stuff. And now they're doing psychedelics and indoctrinating people to believe into this stuff. And I just want you to share your knowledge about. Keep
Yeah.
going,
So
please.
yeah, I bailed out of Church Universal and I started this research thing. And you know me, I couldn't stop. I found it interesting. It
Yeah.
was challenging and interesting.
Yeah.
And toward the end of 1980, members of Church Universal wondered why I wasn't coming to meetings and all of this. And I talked to a few of them just for a few hours each.
Yep.
They got up and left the group. Some of them were in a lot longer than I was involved and
Uh-huh.
deeper,
Yep.
because I could show them, for instance, that where the ascended masters came from and that they're really mind puppets. They're under the control of the messenger or the channeler. They don't have independent agency. And you can do that by doing a comparative analysis. It's really simple, but I'm not going to get into all that right now.
But explain for my listeners, what is a channeler and what is an ascended master? If you could just
All right,
break
so
it down.
yeah, think of them as Hindu gods, Catholic saints on steroids. The ascended master idea came through the Rosicrucians that there was this hidden brotherhood guiding the affairs of mankind, and only certain people that are enlightened and initiated into that inner group could tell us what those great people in that brotherhood were doing. And it's usually male, it was.
Mm-hmm.
So the Rosicrucians spawned the Freemasonry movement in 1717. And it wasn't all bad or good. It was just kind of a men's club with these very esoteric, deistic type of teachings involved in their core. And that the people at the top, the powerful businessmen, they were like that brotherhood listening to the voice of God or ascended masters. Blavatsky, in the mid 19th century and toward the latter 19th century, took this idea and claimed she was directly in touch with named ascended masters named Moria, Kuthumi, Dracul, the Old Man of the Hills, and a couple of others. John King was one earlier in her life. And that these were in this secret, hidden mountain place of Shambhala or Agartha in some traditions. And they could appear in their physical bodies and they could disappear into ethereal bodies. They could bilocate. They had instant thought transference like telepathy. They were like these superhuman Marvel Comics figures, of sorts.
Marvel. I love
I'm
it.
serious. In fact,
No, it's great.
Marvel Comics was inspired by I Am and those kinds of teachings.
Oh.
If you look at the history,
interesting.
these
Not
sacred
surprising.
powers. Right. So we're, in a sense, our whole culture has become part of the occulture, children, everybody is being indoctrinated into this idea that you can get these superpowers.
Mm.
The Smurfs had them, if you watch that, every Disney sorcerer, that you watch has these kinds of powers. So these ascended masters are sorcerers, good magicians, as opposed to and they also believed in black magicians, that there were these war, like the Saint Michael and Satan fighting in the ethers, for your very soul and for the conquest of the destiny of the planet and all this stuff. So, it boils down to what I call radical dualism, which initially back in the early Christian church, and you can see it in the early Jewish, they rejected that kind of thinking because it was world denying, and it was claiming that a man could know the mind of God and therefore more or less be God. In other words, it was overvaluing the tradition, is what it was doing. And so they tried to sober it up by interpreting the Gospels and the Torah in a certain way that kind of made sense here down on this earth and gave us a good, viable social culture along with some worship of God or whatever. But there's always been these radical dualist groups out there. And early on, they were called Gnostic groups. Pythagoras was kind of a pre-Gnostic organization. Gnosis, Gnostic, is this idea that you can grok reality, like Heinlein brought in Stranger in a Strange Land.
Yeah.
That you have this deep inner sense that can know things instantly, and if you cultivate that part of yourself, you can become telepathic and you can send messages and you can send energy and all this crap, so.
Yep. And I can't help but mention Musk now added grok to Twitter or his X.
Yeah. This neo-Gnosticism has permeated the culture. It permeated the hippie culture. One of the favorite books of the hippies was Stranger in a Strange Land. There were about 5 or 6.
Loved it.
Herman Hesse's Siddhartha was one. Carlos Castaneda was another, with his the teachings of Don Juan and A Separate Reality. I mean, you could bundle it up in 10 major sources that caused the consciousness movement.
Yeah, I'll just add our friend John Atack, premier ex-Scientologist in the world, told me he discovered that Hubbard and Heinlein were buddies.
Okay.
So there was a connection there that spawned the hypnosis of Scientology.
So the difference between Heinlein and Hubbard, or Heinlein and Elizabeth Prophet, or Heinlein and any other cult leader, is Heinlein knew it was fiction. He was able to separate the theater and the stage from the audience and the reality outside of the theater. And it was it was metaphorical and all of that, which is how religion should actually work. When cult leaders get a hold of this stuff, like Hubbard or Moon, they claim that the reality is on stage, and they're the directors. Everybody else is in ignorance. Everybody else is somehow unenlightened, and they come to the feet of the master to watch the stage and see reality. This is how, for instance, Manly P. Hall envisioned Shakespeare, Francis Bacon, as being this magus, this incredible kind of Superman prophet that was able to give secret teachings from the stage, And in other words, he flipped reality. He flipped what the stage is all about.
I have to just mention, and I'm sure you've encountered it as much as I have, how many cults use the Matrix movies to recruit and indoctrinate people by saying, you think you know what reality is, but reality is very different. And we'll give you the pill and you will become enlightened and know what's real.
Yeah, when I saw the Matrix, I saw immediately, this is just neo-Gnosticism warmed over. Radical dualism. And look at the thing. It's all about good and evil, fighting it, apocalyptic stuff.
Yeah.
It's using the idea that you're almost going to die to influence you. And we see this throughout all kinds of things, like pills that are sold to you to extend your life and whatever, or religions that are sold to you that, we can save you because certain death is coming. Not only in reality, we're all going to die, but it's going to happen to the whole planet or the whole culture or whatever. There's going to be
Right.
Fire and brimstone. Every generation we hear this.
Apocalypticism. Right.
Right. And it's a good way to manipulate people because we're all kind of a little worried about death.
Yeah.
So, it's the great gaslight of the cosmos.
I don't know if we're gaslight or if it's just the reality of being biologically based organisms.
Right. We're flawed when it comes to that kind of wisdom, and thus we're easily manipulated by people that claim to have that kind of wisdom.
Yep.
So that's basically what it boils down to.
So tell us about a little bit more about what your advice is to people who may be already accepting some of these beliefs, but maybe they have that little critical voice in their head going, this is bullshit. What should they do, Joe, to begin a process of reality testing?
Yeah, that's a tough question because for me to dig out of this took a lot of digging, so it takes work.
Yeah.
All right. And I'm talking about real work. I'm not talking about meditating for 5 hours on it. I'm talking about really discursive thought and meditating on it if you have to, but it does take the shovel work in the dirt, and you're going to have to get into things that you might reject later. So my look at this now is I've been inspired quite a bit for the last decade or more, in fact, 2 decades, by W.R. Bion, the French psychoanalyst who did an interesting study on groups in the late 40s, and it was published in the 50s. And there's a lot of further studies on Bion, and I'll send a link that you can
we'll add to the blog. Yep.
So basically the way I think this happens is Bion was treating neurotic soldiers, World War II people, and neurosis back then was like any kind of PTSD, anxiety. It was a little over the top. What he noticed when he just gave them problem-solving groups to just observe them, he wasn't trying to guide them. He noticed that invariably, and I'm being brief here, the psychopath in the group would end up as the leader. And if there was no psychopath, the narcissist would end up as the leader. Almost all the time. What's interesting about this is people that are neurotic or made to feel neurotic get fooled by people who have congruence and a sense of self that seems more powerful than they are.
Well, certainty. They act
certainty,
certain.
Exactly. And narcissists are very certain about the story about their self, even if it's fake. They can come off as quite believable to some people.
Convincing.
Other people think they're obnoxious, but there's certain people that don't, that are fooled by the narcissist's conviction in himself. And the same thing with someone that's pathological might even go further than that and know some techniques of manipulation. And, once they get positive feedback, they can up the ante, to the point where they can get somebody to kill somebody for them. It gets that, or to become a martyr for the cause. Let me put it that way, if you want to look at it religiously.
Well, that's what happened to me in the Moonies, I have to confess.
Right. I think it happens in every totalist group. And it happens in almost every military. When you look at the training, the idea is that you will follow a command even if you're going to get killed.
Yeah.
That's the purpose of it, not
kill
to
a
make
stranger.
you a better fighter. Yeah. Now, I'm not arguing against military because you obviously are living in a world where you have to defend yourself sometimes, and that's reality.
Yep.
But it doesn't mean that both militaries aren't using brainwashing techniques in order to get their ends. So that's just the reality.
Yep.
So with Bion, he observed these groups and he saw that what's happening is, in his view, which has been expanded, but he saw 3 basic assumption groups or basic assumption states. One was the dependency state, where there was a leader. Another one was called the pairing state, where the group felt if they kept at it, they could produce a messiah, produce a leader. Another would be born from them in some way. They would elect them or whatever. And then the other one was fight or flight group. So they would be always on edge. And, if the people on the outside didn't believe in them, they'd want to fight them. If the people on the outside were powerful, they would flee, So they wouldn't do what Bion suggested to solve these problems, which was to go into what's called a working group. And that meant you have to let go of your basic assumptions of fear and dependency and thinking you're going to produce a messiah and thinking that it's us against them in the world, and move into more of a discursive working group where you're compromising, where you're looking at outside information, where you're trying to inform yourself to become a healthier human being. And once he got these people into his working group, he could work with them better, and they were healing better from this state that they were in, this neurosis. So that model I kind of like. It's only one. There's many out there, but I kind of like the idea that if you're collapsed into a basic assumption group, which cults are, like Pythagoras, anything that's an ism is a basic assumption group. Marxism, scientism, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Totalism. But we both had to, deconstruct our belief system and go, what's the source of this? Is it legitimate? Are there facts, or is this stolen from another place? Is this biblical verses taken out of context? And I needed to do the work. But what helped me a lot was just the starting with the Liftons and the singers and learning about brainwashing and understanding how do you create a new identity? How do you change somebody over against their own conscience and critical thinking and values?
I think to your credit, like most people that have done the kind of work, and I'm using Beyond's idea of work that you did, you came up with a model that works for you that you can help other people with. The bite model, right? And you used Lifton and Singer and whatever. So you're working the system. We can use our colleague Janja Lalich. She found another way to work it. There's a lot of parallels in her work and yours, but she came up with something called bounded choice. It's still, there's similarities. I came up with something called the self-sealing social system. I like the 4 S's. And if any group starts becoming self-sealing as a social system and applying it to all of reality, like a totalist system, then I'm planting a red flag. I'm going to say, take a look at this. What's going on here? Because I'm seeing contraction, not expansion. I'm seeing exclusion, not inclusion. I'm seeing collapsing into a basic assumption model. I'm not seeing working to make this better.
Beautiful. I want to include that in the blog, the self-sealing. So what I want to say the obvious, which is every model is a trap. It may give you tools to be more effective, to understand reality, but always remember it's a model, and you need to include other models, and you need to be open to changing your mind and saying, you know what, this model worked, but now there's a better model, and just separate your ego from your model and just go for what works.
Steve, this is why I feel, and I have felt, that the U.S. model, for all its flaws, is one of the best models out there for civilization. Plato a long time ago called this the noble lie, when we try to organize society to create a polis, a city-state. It's not real. We invent it. So Shankar Vedantam calls it useful delusion. So these things aren't bad. We have models of society. We're not like ants that are instinctually created to create hives and create colonies and act a certain way. We have, unfortunately, as mentioned in Genesis, been kicked out of the Garden of Eden. We're no longer animals. We're no longer insects. We have this prefrontal cortex. We examine, we make judgments, and we do a lot of things very differently than the animal creation out there. And we have to figure out who we are. So we have to maintain a working reality. And by the separation of powers, by education systems that we set into place that are working reality systems, not based on a religious model, we can keep a healthy society going. And I think that was the genius of Hamilton and Jefferson, and Washington went along with it, and these guys early in that experiment, Franklin especially, he saw the value of public education. And all of that's on assault right now in these oligarchical, super nationalistic societies that are trying to sell national identity as personal identity. And the idea of a working model of society, a changing model, changing for good, so to speak, has become a model to move back into something that they thought worked in the past, which didn't,
Right.
but they want to cram us back into the tube of what I call fascism,
And fantasy stuff,
and
fascism. Yep. So we have
well, well,
5 minutes left, but keep
right.
going because I really want people, as we're moving towards the election and beyond, to
Mm-hmm.
realize the moment, the existential moment we
Mm-hmm.
seem to be in. And I'd love
See,
to hear your
so
wisdom.
yeah, in saying what I'm saying, I'm not against the conservative point of view, which any society needs that push and pull between what we call liberal or progressive and conservative. You need to save some things that are good,
Right.
and you need to change things that are not so good.
Right.
And there's a push and pull in healthy societies. The progressives might not like it, but sometimes it's good to tighten up on the economy.
Right.
And then the conservatives might not like it, but sometimes it's good to change the way you look at gay people. You know,
Right.
so, or the way you look at slaves, or the way you look at freedom to vote for women. Sometimes that's really good, and sometimes it's good to see children not as property, but as human
Human
beings that need to be
rights.
nourished, that have
Right.
human rights.
Yeah.
Exactly. So this push and pull is necessary. So I'm not pro-liberal or pro-conservative. I'm just looking for a healthy working model of both or any mix of that kind of thing to happen. That has not happened lately. From my experience with Church Universal and Triumph and the I Am cult, I see a lot of the same red flags that I experienced in those cults happening now in the conservative movement in the United States. And I think it's really unhealthy and unfortunate. I think most Republicans sense it, but they want to win, and so they keep going along with it. And the one thing I'd like to point out, which I point out to my clients often, is when you look at fascist Germany, only 10% of the German nation joined the Nazi Party.
Yep.
The rest kind of just went along,
Yep.
right? So if you get 10% MAGA nation, you've got a dangerous situation here. You don't need everybody to believe in it.
Right. It is
So
dangerous for sure.
and the money people behind this know this. They know you don't need that big a number.
Right.
So I think that we are in, politically speaking, kind of interesting times.
Right.
And no matter who wins, we'll get through this. I think the
Mm.
United States is big enough and strong enough and smart enough that we should be able to adjust even the worst presidencies. Hopefully.
Well, I see this organized effort over 50 years to destroy the administrative state, the federal government, get rid of regulations, especially against fossil fuel promotion, because it's heating our planet and destroying our environment and changing our climate and affecting everybody in negative ways. And I feel like we need to educate the public that brainwashing and mind control is real, that it happens to smart people like yourself and myself, but that there's a way out, that there's millions of us, former members, who could be sharing our story, destigmatizing the idea that, yep, I was in a totalist group for 10 years or whatever, and now I have a life, and now I have a PhD or whatever. And normalize it and just like challenge the wrong model that we're rational beings and you turn 18 and you can make good decisions. No. And now with computers and AI and smartphones and psychological warfare by state actors, people really need to understand this is not normal. And we need to make some really important choices about how we spend our time and our energy going forward.
Yeah. Let me end with this. The Church
Please.
Universal and Triumphant under Elizabeth Prophet, I remember her saying, because I was there at one of the conferences, that we're going to take the U.S. government, we're going to shake it upside down and inside out. And when the dust settles, this is through decreeing, annihilation decrees, getting rid of the wrong people, putting the right judges in and all that stuff. Then the ascended masters will begin to guide the government, and the Christed ones will run the USA as they should. So what does that sound like? That sounds like General Flynn,
Yeah.
Or Lieutenant General Flynn,
Yeah.
Michael Flynn.
And QAnon.
And we have video of him praying before a group of people using an Elizabeth Clare Prophet kind of a decree.
Yep.
And you can see it in parallel. Our friend Jim put these up on his, and it's very clear that kind of old I am fascist idea is at the core of what's driving this sick aspect of conservatism right now. And I call it sick because I think there are healthy versions of it.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I was in the room with Moon when he said we need to infiltrate the government. Democracy is satanic. We need to have a theocracy to rule the world. And when we take over, we'll amend the Constitution and make it a capital offense for people who don't follow the rules regarding sexuality and the arranged marriages of the Moonies. And I was like, yes, Father. I thought that was a good idea in 1974,
well,
5 and 6.
Think about this, Steve. Every angry person that wants to fix the world, their instinct is to rule from the top. They want to, this is how it's to be. And if you don't do it, I'm going to put a gun to your head. That's the easy model. I don't know how many times I've heard, even where I was working, people that are supposed to be social workers say things about, when we were attacked, the 9/11 thing happened in 2001. Suddenly there was this Muslim hate. And you could hear people saying things like, we should just go blow them all up. That kind of reaction from people terrible. I knew that knew better.
Yeah.
But that was their reaction.
Us versus them.
Us versus them. It's the basic assumption group of fight or flight.
Yeah. And fascinating. Beyond. That's another thing you taught me today. I need to learn more about this French.
Yeah. BION.
BION.
WR Beyond. Yeah. There's a few books. They're interesting. Personally, I find it useful. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying it's the end of the game. I'm just finding it very useful. I'm a pragmatist at this stage of my life. I try to see what works best. And I try to follow that model of working the ideas. Yeah. And if I have to discard something, I do. But some of the stuff I've come up with sticks. It's pretty good.
It's brilliant work. I'm so grateful that you exist, that we're colleagues, that we care, that we're trying to help educate and share our journeys with everybody else. I'll just end with the Moonies are still around. They have a gun cult in Pennsylvania and a gun factory and training compounds. They paid Trump $2.5 million to endorse them. They have the Washington Times Foundation, which is the single biggest climate science denier entity on the planet. And so people need to identify sources of information that they need to understand is not legitimate, that has an agenda.
Yes. Yeah. All right, Steve.
So thank you again, Joe Szimhart, rock and roll.
I appreciate it.
And your website is jszimhart.com, JSZIMHART.com, and you have a YouTube channel, and it is called, it's in your bio somewhere. What do you call your YouTube channel?
I don't even know. It's under J. Szimhart, The Cults and the Occulture.
Cults and the Occulture. Brilliant stuff. Please go check him out. Thank you again, Joe.
Thanks, Steve.
Steve Hassan here. It's been decades since my family rescued me from the Moonies. I've been at this for over 47 years. The need has never been greater. If you're able, please consider hitting the super thanks button below, and it'll help us to do better. Every penny will help us toward our goal of educating the planet about undue influence. Remember, it's your mind. Only you should control it.